You've sent us some really interesting stuff before, but this time, digging into why some people seem to pick up English so much faster than others, that really hit home.
Hmm.
It's a question like so many of us have, right? Whether we're learning languages ourselves or just watching others do it. You shared some fascinating bits from a podcast exploring just that.
That's right. This source you found, it really dives deep into the different, elements that contribute to the speed people acquire
Mm.
English. It looks at, well, everything from our first thoughts about talent, right down to the nitty-gritty of learning methods, and even like our emotional ties to the language.
And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. We really want to get past that simple idea that some folks are just, good at languages.
Yeah, the language gene idea.
Exactly. And really understand what drives that rapid progress in English. So, where does this podcast episode even start trying to demystify that fast track?
Well, it kicks things off by tackling a really common idea, this whole notion of innate talent.
Ah.
It's so easy to look at someone who just seems to soak up languages and think, wow, they were just born with it. What did the source say about that?
It definitely pushes back on that hard. While, okay, it admits some people might have a bit of a natural knack for it.
A predisposition, maybe?
Yeah, predisposition. But it really stresses that things like how motivated you are, how much you actually surround yourself with English, and the specific ways you try to learn, those are way more important in the long run.
Mm,
It's less about some magic ability and much more about what you do.
that totally resonates. It's like, thinking someone's a natural athlete. Sure, they might have some physical gifts,
Right.
but without the training, the discipline, the smart strategies, they won't hit their peak.
Mm.
The source also touches on some of the science behind language learning, doesn't it?
Does, yeah. It mentions stuff like age and if you've learned other languages before, even like how your brain is wired.
Brain connectivity and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. And while those things are part of the picture, the big takeaway is they aren't the whole story. And they definitely don't decide your fate, how fast you'll learn.
And what's great is how the podcast uses a real-world example to show this. Tell us about Maria.
Yeah, Maria, she's 35 from Spain, and her story's pretty inspiring, actually.
Okay.
She started learning English later, that point where lots of people think, oh, it's too late, it's much harder now.
The critical period myth, almost.
Right. But through just sheer consistent effort and really immersing herself, she got fluent in just 2 years.
Wow, 2 years. That's impressive.
It really drives home how much dedication can overcome those perceived hurdles, like starting later.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It just underlines that starting later doesn't mean you can't make quick progress if you've got the right mindset and, crucially, the right strategies.
Yeah.
So for anyone listening, if you've ever felt like, oh, I missed the boat, Maria's story is proof that hard work and a smart approach can make a world of difference.
Exactly. And speaking of smart approaches, the next big thing this podcast episode talks about is the massive impact of immersion.
Immersion, always key.
And look, this isn't just packing your bags and moving, though that helps, obviously.
Right, it's more accessible than that.
It's about actively weaving English into your everyday life, wherever you happen to be.
And what's really interesting is the kind of psychological angle they bring in.
Mm.
They explain that when you're constantly surrounded by English, reading it, hearing it, trying to speak it, writing it, it actually helps reduce what psychologists call cognitive load.
Cognitive load, like mental effort.
Exactly. The brain power you need to process everything.
Yeah.
Over time, immersion makes using English less of a conscious, struggle and more automatic, more intuitive.
That makes total sense. I mean, think about how we learned our first language, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't flashcards and grammar rules 247. It was just being surrounded by it, needing it to ask for things, to understand stories.
Constant exposure and use.
Exactly. Immersion kind of taps into that more natural learning system. And the story of John, the engineer from Germany, really nails this.
Okay, so how did John use immersion?
Well, he made a really conscious decision to switch almost all his media consumption to English.
Like everything.
Pretty much. TV shows, movies, music, podcasts sound familiar, all in English. And he found that, pretty quickly his understanding and his speaking really jumped up dramatically.
That's a great example. Just consistent exposure working its magic.
It really is.
And for you listening, the takeaway is to really think, okay, how can I deliberately build more English into my day?
Yeah.
Doesn't have to be a huge upheaval, small things, right?
Yeah.
Switching your phone language
Yeah.
maybe. Listening to a quick English news podcast in the morning, watching that YouTube channel you like, but in English,
Those small, consistent bits add up. They start creating that immersive bubble.
Exactly.
Okay, so the podcast goes beyond just being around English and dives into the specific learning strategies that seem to really speed things up.
All right, this is where we get into the real nuts and bolts, isn't it?
Yeah, the how-to.
Okay, so it points out three main strategies that successful learners often use. The first one is active engagement. What's that about?
Active engagement. It's basically about using the language, not just passively soaking it up.
So speaking and writing.
Yeah, actively joining conversations, even if you're hesitant, even if you know you'll mess up. Trying to build your own sentences, not just repeating phrases.
And why is that active part so critical? What does it do?
Well, it forces your brain to actually retrieve the words and grammar and put them together. You might understand a rule when you read it.
Sure, passive understanding.
Right, but using it spontaneously in a real conversation, that's a whole different skill. And that active production really cements the learning in a way just listening or reading often doesn't.
Makes sense. Okay, strategy number 2 they mention is spaced repetition.
Ah, yes. This one's super interesting, and the source even brings in the cognitive science behind it. Can you unpack spaced repetition for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So spaced repetition is basically a clever way to review stuff like new words or grammar at increasingly longer intervals.
Okay.
So you might learn a new word today, review it again in, say, 10 minutes, then maybe tomorrow, then in 3 days, then a week, and so on. The gaps get bigger each time.
And the idea is to catch it just before you forget it.
Exactly. There's this concept in psychology called the forgetting curve. We naturally forget things over time. Spaced repetition fights that curve by reminding you at strategic points, just as the memory starts to fade. This makes long-term recall way, way better than just, cramming it all in one night.
Right, no more all-nighters trying to memorize vocab lists.
Hopefully not. And the third key strategy mentioned is contextual learning.
Contextual learning, so learning words and situations, not just from a list.
Precisely. It's about understanding new words and phrases based on the real-life scenarios where they're actually used.
Why is that context piece so important?
Well, because language isn't just like a dictionary of words and rules, is it?
No, it's communication.
Exactly. It's a tool we use in specific situations, within cultures. When you learn words in context, you pick up on the subtle shades of meaning, how they fit in socially, maybe even cultural vibes that a simple definition just can't give you.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The source gives an example here too, right? Li, the student from China.
Yes, Li. She apparently combined using flashcards with spaced repetition, getting that memory boost.
Right.
And she actively looked for chances to talk with language partners. So combining those strategies.
And what was the result for her?
Pretty transformative, according to the source. Her vocabulary shot up thanks to the spaced repetition. And the speaking practice didn't just build her fluency, it also crucially boosted her confidence, made her less afraid to actually use the language out there in the real world.
That's huge. Confidence is such a big part of it.
It really is. And for listeners wanting to try this, the source actually mentions helpful tools like Anki or Quizlet, apps specifically designed for spaced repetition.
Oh, right. They kind of automate the scheduling for you.
Exactly. Takes the guesswork out, makes it way easier to stick with that strategy, which we know is super effective.
Okay, great practical tip there. Now, we've talked a lot about how you learn, but the source also dives into something really fundamental that maybe gets overlooked sometimes, your actual mindset.
Ah, yes, the power of the mind. Motivation and mindset are absolutely critical, aren't they?
Totally. The podcast brings up the idea of a growth mindset. Can you explain what they mean by that?
Sure. A growth mindset, as the source lays it out, is basically believing that your abilities, your intelligence, your language skills aren't fixed things you're just born with.
Okay.
Instead, it's the belief that you can develop them, you can improve them through hard work, through dedication, through trying different strategies. It's the opposite of a fixed mindset where you think, well, I'm either good at languages or I'm not.
Right. I just don't have the language gene.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
And the source mentions Carol Dweck's research here, which is pretty well known. Why is having that growth mindset so important, specifically for learning a language?
Well, think about it. Learning a language is almost never a straight line upwards, is it?
Definitely not. Lots of bumps.
Lots of bumps. Plateaus where you feel stuck, frustrating moments, loads of mistakes. With a growth mindset, you see those challenges differently.
How so?
Instead of seeing them as proof you're no good, you see them as like information, as opportunities to learn something new, to adjust your approach. It makes you way more resilient.
More likely to stick with it when things get tough.
Exactly. More likely to keep practicing, and that ultimately leads to more success.
And there's another example here, Ahmed, the businessman from Egypt. How does his story fit in?
Well, Ahmed apparently hit quite a few roadblocks learning English, but because he fundamentally believed he could get better.
That growth mindset in action.
Yeah. He didn't let setbacks stop him. He saw them as, temporary hurdles, and that persistence, driven by his mindset, is what eventually got him to fluency.
It's a powerful message.
Yeah.
And the practical tip that comes out of this is so valuable for any learner. Try to embrace mistakes.
Easier said than done sometimes.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
But they aren't failures, are they? They're feedback. They show you where you need to focus. And just trying to keep a positive attitude towards the whole messy process can really fuel your motivation.
Absolutely. Okay, so changing gears slightly, the podcast episode also shines a light on the amazing tools we have now, thanks to technology. How technology can genuinely speed up language learning.
Yeah, this area is exploding, isn't it? What specific kinds of tech did the source mention?
It highlighted a few key types. First, you've got the popular language learning apps, Duolingo, Babbel, Memrise, those kinds.
Structured lessons, often gamified.
Exactly. Then it talked about the rise of AI tutors, things using tech like ChatGPT to actually simulate conversations and give you instant feedback.
Whoa, okay, like talking to a bot.
Kind of, yeah. A bot that can correct your grammar or suggest better ways to phrase things. And finally, it mentions speech recognition tools like ELSA Speak, which are designed purely to help you nail your pronunciation.
Okay, so apps, AI tutors, pronunciation tools. What's the big advantage they offer? Why are they effective?
I think a huge one is the immediate feedback.
Right. No waiting for a teacher.
Exactly. If you make a mistake, the tech can often flag it right away. That lets you correct yourself in the moment, which is super helpful for making the right patterns stick in your brain.
Helps with memory, yeah.
Plus, a lot of these tools offer personalized learning. They adapt to your level, your pace, your weak spots.
That sounds really useful. And the example they gave was Sarah, the nurse from Brazil,
Yeah.
using apps on her commute.
Yeah. She used AI-powered apps just during her travel time to work. Time that would otherwise be, dead time.
Mm-hmm.
And she reported seeing real, noticeable improvements in her speaking just from that consistent, bite-sized practice.
It just shows how technology can make learning fit into our busy lives, doesn't it?
Totally. Makes it much more accessible.
So the advice for listeners here is basically explore what's out there. See how these tech tools could maybe supplement what you're already doing.
Yeah, find something that works for you. That flexibility and personalization can make learning feel less like a chore and maybe even speed things up.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so the final piece of this puzzle, according to the podcast source, is something maybe a bit softer, but still really important. Cultural and emotional factors.
Yeah, this is a really interesting angle. It's not just about grammar and vocab.
So how do things like culture and our feelings actually affect how fast we learn?
Well, the idea is it goes beyond just the mechanics of language. When you actively engage with English-speaking cultures, maybe through movies, music, books, online groups.
Connecting with the culture behind the language.
Right. And when you form actual emotional connections, maybe through friendships with English speakers or just really loving English music or something, it does a couple of things.
Okay.
It massively boosts your motivation, for one,
Mm-hmm.
and it helps you understand the language in a much richer, more nuanced way. You get the context.
And the source brings in a psychological point here too, doesn't it? About emotional relevance.
It does. It says that when something is emotionally relevant to you, you remember it better.
Ah, okay. So if you care about the conversation, you'll retain the language used in it more effectively.
Exactly. It makes the whole learning process more engaging, more memorable. You're more likely to remember and actually use language that connects to something or someone you care about.
That feels intuitively right.
Yeah.
And the story of Tomoko, the chef from Japan, illustrates this.
Yeah, her story was about how making friends with English speakers completely changed her learning.
How so?
It stopped being just about, memorizing stuff for a test. It became about actually connecting with people, sharing things, understanding their world through their language.
Made it meaningful.
Super meaningful. And that emotional connection apparently helped her pick up all those subtle things, idioms, humor, tone, in a really natural way, just by being part of those interactions.
That's a lovely example. So the practical tip for listeners is,
Basically, seek out those connections. Find ways to engage with the culture and the people that make English feel personal to you.
could be joining a conversation club, finding online friends who share your hobbies.
Or even just diving deep into English language movies or books that you genuinely love. Make it enjoyable, make it relevant.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together from this really insightful podcast source, it seems pretty clear. While, yeah, people learn at different speeds, that idea of fixed talent being the main driver, mostly a myth.
Yeah, seems that way.
The real accelerators seem to be things we can actually control and cultivate, really immersing ourselves, using smart strategies like active practice and spaced repetition,
Developing that growth mindset, believing we can improve,
making smart use of the technology that's available now.
and building those cultural and emotional bridges to the language.
It's quite a toolkit, really.
It is, and it's so important to remember, and this is for you, listening, your language journey is yours alone. There's no single magic recipe, right?
No one size fits all.
But by focusing on putting in consistent effort, and by strategically weaving in some of these ideas we've talked about, you absolutely can make real progress, and maybe, just maybe, speed things up a bit.
So that leaves us with a final question, really. A bit of food for thought for everyone listening. As you think about all these factors, the immersion, the strategies, the mindset, the tech, the cultural links, which area do you feel you could focus on a bit more intentionally right now in your own English learning?
That's a great question.
And maybe what's just one small concrete step you could take, maybe even this week, to bring one of these insights into how you're currently learning? Something to definitely mull over as you carry on with your language adventure.